Now, Sangayo has been extremely anxious. Do you want to know why? Because I've been trying to figure out the solutions to what we're experiencing. They're all in our fundamental text, right? Because there's the blueprint as to what solutions there are if the state, if the federal, if the branches turn to tyranny, right? I was under the illusion that a state must exhaust the courts in order to be capable of going beyond tradition and utilizing like our most natural rights in order to defend against an encroaching federal right, which is complicated if Scott is the highest court will refuse to actually hold independence, right? If they are already judging in accordance to the consolidation of power, the fact that they're corrupt and not independent, this is helped by the fact that Article 3 is incomplete. Their actual blueprint is decided by the legislature, right? By Congress. So the courts have an authority based on settled law, not fundamental law, because Article 3 of the judiciary is incomplete. So ultimately, their oath is much more to the audacity that the Congress has allowed for them to keep versus that is actually given by the Constitution, right? Because of this and the fact that the president has complete obedience over the administrative state, including all the different agencies of policymaking and also immigration judges, right? Positions a constellation of power not only in the executive but also in the judicial, which is ultimately the last one that is consolidating, and they've already gotten the Congress, right? Majority MAGA. Well, that was my initial interpretation. Reading again under the pressure of what's happening, I now recognize that is untrue. In fact, with John Locke, the author of Wherever Law Ends, Tyranny Begins, which is engraved into the DOJ building in DC, positions that truly the trigger to a state, within context of course, being capable of moving outside of tradition is actually the expiration of an individual. Let me read it. There can be no pretense for force, so no excuse, which is only to be used where man is intercepted from appealing to the law. For nothing is to be accounted hostile force, but where it leaves not the remedy of such an appeal, and it is such force alone that puts him that uses it into a state of war and makes it lawful to resist him. So I was under the impression that you had to go to the court, and the court had to prove themselves to not be independent, right? But then the problem is the court aren't going to say, I'm not independent, and therefore they're going to continue to breadcrumb you into believing that the courts are working. Particularly in our experience, lower courts can or cannot go for him, but higher court, the Scottish, is the one that ultimately has final say, and that's the one he has. But a little bit further, it says, because the one using force which threatened my life, I could not have time to appeal to the law to secure it. So, this is what I tell you. The problem with law is that it is intended to rectify wrongdoing, right? But if there is wrongdoing being done unconstitutionally, what our justice system within the state is wanting to do is go to the courts to prevent that, but the harm is still being done. How do you prevent that? You prevent that from government, right? But federal Congress, Democrats don't have that power. It has to come from the state, the protection, right? But the state is below the federal under a constitutional legitimacy, right? But we're in a crisis. Don't forget that. So when it is gone, it was too late to appeal. So once you're harmed, unalived, it's too late to appeal. The law could not restore life to my dead carcass. The loss was irreparable, which to prevent, the law of nature gave me a right to destroy him, who had put himself in a state of war with me and threatened my destruction. Now, this is my theory, the fact that either DHS, the federal agents, or I guess the military will unalive an American citizen, and therefore that's going to give the lawful reasoning for particularly the state to be capable of responding, like in California, if an American citizen is unalive during one of these immigration things. The state can finally enforce through the 2A of a militia against the federal, and it's going to be lawful. Think of it as like V for Vendetta, when the final blow was when they unalived the little girl. Think of Indonesia, when the unaliving of the delivery driver was the one that blew it back. And Dominican Republic, they had unalived, I believe it was 3 or 2 women who were dissenting against the ruler. And that really is what collapsed that administration. You're going to ask, where what's the difference between California doing something like this and the Confederacy? Because the Confederacy wanted to erode the Constitution, which is exactly what this federal government is wanting to do. California wants to restore it, and to do it, you have to go against the one eroding of it, right? Now, Federalist 33 positions if the federal government should overpass the just bounds of its authority and make a tyrannical use of its power, you must appeal to the contract they have formed and take such measures to correct the violation done to the Constitution. And that's what we're saying, exhausting, right? First, the executive, but that's consolidated by POTUS. The administrative agencies have to abide by his version of law in the Constitution, which is against constitutional supremacy, because that means not that POTUS or the federal is above the branches, right? It is that the Constitution at the forefront is above all the branches. Then we have the legislative, that's Congress. It is controlled by MAGA, right? We have the judicial, which is the courts, which on the lower courts, they could go for him or they won't. But on the highest court, the Supreme Court, they're going for him because they're not independent, they're corrupt. So ultimately, the question becomes, when we exhaust that judicial and they are using lazy interpretations or not independent decisions based on their faith or originalism, which is the beliefs of our founders versus the text itself, which is against constitutional supremacy, because if the Constitution is supreme, then the founding fathers' opinions cannot be right. And what Federalist 52 tells us is that the danger from legislative takeovers, which by collecting all powers in same hands must lead to the same tyranny as is threatened by executive takeovers. An example is Texas lawmakers stealing Democrat seats to take over federal Congress beyond 2026. Missouri is now included in this. Federalist 47 by James Madison, our fourth president. The hoarding of all federal powers, legislative, so lawmaking, executive, POTUS, and judiciary courts in the same hands, whether of one, of few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elected, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So they have consolidated the executive, they have consolidated the legislative, and they are consolidating the judiciary, and depending on your state, it can be already, towards a much more harmful reality, like in California, where Latinos can be treated as non-citizens. That is 40% of the population. That is 15 million of nearly 40 million. That is saying that what was here before white people is considered immigrant when the immigrants were the white people, right? Hispanic was here before we were a state, and Spanish was here before we were a state. But now you can be treated as non-citizens for being it. This is a violation of state rights. This is a violation of the history that was ratified into this country as California. Federalist 78, there is no liberty if the power of judging be not separated from the legislative and executive powers, the medium of the courts, whose duty must be to declare all acts contrary to the voice of the Constitution unconstitutional. The power of the people is superior to all branches, where the will of the legislator declared in its law stands against that of the people declared in the Constitution. The judges ought to be governed by the Constitution rather than the law. They ought to regulate their decisions by the fundamental laws rather than by settled law. Settled law can be changed because that's not in the text. Fundamental law requires amendments, not necessarily just a judicial change, because if the Constitution says the sky is blue, the courts cannot say, I disagree. The founding fathers would have wanted it to be green. Unless it's changed, they cannot say that. If there should happen to be an incompatible conflict between the two, that which has the superior obligation ought to be preferred, or in other words, the Constitution ought to be preferred to the law, the constitutional text to the intention of the lawmakers. We must recognize that until the people have by some solemn and authoritative act, that is Article 5, the Amendment Clause, repealed or changed the Constitution, it is binding upon themselves collectively as well as individually, and no presumption or even knowledge of their failings can warn their officials in a departure from it prior to such an act. That includes citizenship, that includes due process, that includes the fact that Latinos have citizenship if we are citizens, and we should not be treated as non-citizens because of our heritage, right? Why am I telling you? Federalist 28, the obstacles to take over and the strategies of resistance increase with the increased harm of the government, provided Americans understand their rights and are disposed to defend them. Examples include Yes on Prop 50, banning of ice masks, Disney boycotts, the music festivals, all unprecedented. The natural strength of the people in a large community in proportion to the artificial strength of the government is greater than in a small, and of course more competent to the fight with attempts of the government to establish a tyranny.